There are 7 things that nobody told me when I started off programming, and they ended up causing me no end of grief. If I could go back in time and mentor myself, these are the things that I would pass on. This first lesson took me like 5 to 10 years to learn, and I learned it the hard way. I wish someone could have gone back and whacked me over the head to teach me this properly, because even now I have difficulty following this piece of advice. That is, that when I started out programming and I was trying to get into it, I was really excited. I actually loved learning things like React and creating in Hello World. All of that phase was awesome, except for Angular, which I had nightmares about. But what ended up happening was that I would jump from place to place, from tutorial to tutorial, and I would just sort of dive into the shallow section of it and then sort of just give up and move on to another thing that excited me. The problem was that I never actually learned anything properly, and this meant that I was in a constant state of learning without actually really understanding or having wisdom or knowledge about any one particular thing. What ended up changing was when I actually got a job and some projects, and I had to force myself to learn something inside and out. That's not just doing the Hello World, but really diving deep and going into some of the advanced aspects of a language or a framework. This helped me to grow as a developer, and what I ended up learning is that you can't just start learning program, you have to stay consistent with it. And this means that you have to pick something that you really want to learn, whether it's say React or Angular, or well, not Angular, but like maybe Vue or Svelte, and really dive deep into it. This will allow you to grow as a developer so much more than just doing tutorial and tutorial, because you will grasp the language at a better, more fundamental level than just doing the Hello World. And this brings me to this second lesson that I've learned for learning new programming languages or frameworks is just something new entirely, which often is one of the hardest things to do. Just being able to stay consistent, there has to be a trick behind it. Because when I'm going into learning, say, React or, for example, Svelte, then I'm finding myself struggling to go through the documentation and really try and continue doing maybe a bland tutorial that just has no interest to me whatsoever. So what I've found as I've progressed is that the best way for me to learn is not by directly reading the bland documentation, but to actually do a project and learn the language indirectly as a byproduct of creating a passion project that I'm actually interested in. I find myself way more motivated to trying to figure out problems that I'm having just to get something implemented, and by doing it this way, I found myself learning a lot more of whatever I'm trying to learn just because the passion for the actual item I'm building far exceeds the difficulty of learning the new thing that I'm trying to learn. And this brings me to my third lesson, something that nobody told me, which is that there's a bit of a myth around programmers needing to know so many things, even for junior roles. And I think this myth is propagated by job applications, just needing you to know front-end and back-end and cloud and pretty much everything for a job that you might not ever use all those things for. And I know that this actually scared me away from even applying for jobs. And for the longest time, I actually tried to upskill myself to actually learn all of these things, which isn't very practical, because when I spread myself thin learning so many different things all in one go, I never really learned one particular thing very well. So what I ended up finding out when I started applying for jobs is that you only ever work with one tech mostly. And for my experience, that has been React, and something I would recommend everyone learn. From that, I found that knowing more languages and frameworks doesn't usually get you promoted. It's actually specializing in that one thing that you really enjoy doing that gets you a better job position or more salary or anything in between. So that's what my takeaway is to make sure that you focus in on one particular language or framework that you want to do and try and expand your knowledge in that area. And this brings me to my next lesson, one that nobody told me, and it might make a few people upset, but it's the fact that promotions are a bit of a lie, especially in developer roles, because I've experienced myself, and I'm sure a lot of people have themselves too, the fact that promotions are very difficult to get. And when you do get them, they aren't as meaningful as you might expect them to be. What ended up happening for me is that I applied for a job which I worked in for about 5 to 6 years, and I found that I did not learn anything new. If anything, I was stuck doing the same old boring WordPress stuff to the point where it was so mundane and boring that I just needed to get myself out of there. So I applied for a new job on a lower salary, but I ended up actually testing myself, working on new things and growing as a developer. And again, I wasn't able to get promoted in that job, but it allowed me the opportunity to jump jobs again and get a higher salary, work on new and interesting things again. So what I ended up finding out is that in order to actually improve yourself, improve what you're working on, and to get a higher salary, you do need to jump from job to job sometimes. Of course, you have to do this within reason, making sure that you're also interested in the stuff you're doing. And if your current employer is sort of helping you grow in your career, then that's great. But if they're not, then it's time to look for new opportunities. Now that we have a baseline for some of the things in our career as well as some of the learnings that we need to do, one of the things that nobody told me about were the people aspect of it. I'm a bit of an introvert, and for the longest period of time I lived in my own little bubble. Whether it was learning courses, going through school, or much other things, I sort of was not really talking to anyone, and it was to my own detriment. What ended up happening much later in my career was that a lot of people seemed to get these great opportunities, and I was asking them how they did this, and they just said it was through their network. It was who you know and not what you know. So I changed up my game and I started talking to more people, going to more events, and what I ended up finding is that I actually made some really good friendships, and it was those friendships that led to the opportunities of new jobs that I would have never had otherwise. It was those friendships also that helped me grow as a developer. When I didn't know things, I could ask questions to my friends and they would help me out. And I think that this sometimes goes unnoticed because a lot of developers are introverted. So I think sometimes pushing yourself out of that bubble and just trying to meet new people is such an important thing. And so the next one here is a lesson that I learned the hard way by burning myself out. And that's the fact that sometimes money isn't as important as having more freedom and satisfaction in your job. This is something that I didn't learn until much later, because usually there's a cap that you reach when you're working where additional money doesn't really make you much happier. Instead, having more freedom does. And for me, this meant that when I was working in a career and I got a promotion, I had more responsibilities and more risk, and I was finding myself working all day and all night to the point where I just had no more energy and I wasn't sure why I was even doing it. So what I did was I actually swapped jobs and I took a smaller salary. This gave me the option of working from home. It also gave me flexible working hours, so instead of working all day, I could work more in the nights, which is when I'm much more productive. And all these other things that basically meant I felt a lot more free, and this freedom meant that I was so much more happier doing the work. And this brings me to my final lesson that no one really tells you, but you sort of have to take on board yourself, and that is that it's really important to be able to take breaks as a developer. Some of the thinking that you do with your subconscious mind doesn't happen when you're actively doing a task, but it happens when you're away from that task. For a long period when I was a developer, I was working a full-time job, and then I would go home and work on more development projects or hobbies and ideas that I had in the background. This meant that I was programming for 10 to 12 hours a day, and this is just not sustainable for a long time. It leads to burnout, and I found myself basically unable to solve problems during my day job and just being stuck or unmotivated in the future. So what I ended up doing is taking a step back and just doing some hobbies of things outside of development, like going to the gym or playing some Nintendo. And by sitting back and relaxing, I found myself much more motivated when I jumped back into the programming. And I think that it's an important thing to do, to understand your limits and understanding what is a healthy amount to do some work, because when you go outside of that, you won't be able to sustain it in the long run.